In this video we'll look at structured programming. This is section 11.3 in the CIE 9618 Computer Science A-Level course. First of all, let's look at what we need to be able to do. So you need to be able to define and use procedures, define and use functions, use arguments and parameters, and use the correct terminology when talking about these. So as our programs get larger and more complex, they often need to do the same thing in many different places within the code. Writing the same code multiple times is a waste of time for you, the programmer. It can lead to more errors. Your code could be inconsistent. You could do the same thing slightly differently each time. It makes the program larger and more complex to understand, and they're more difficult to maintain and debug. So structured programming solves the problems by extracting reusable named blocks of code and putting them in subroutines. So if you have the same thing done multiple times, you take that code out, put it into a subroutine, and then whenever you need to use it, you just call it by name. We have two types, procedures and functions. A procedure is a named block of statements that perform a task. They're called by name and they're a complete statement on their own line of the program. A function is a named block of statements that always returns a single value. It's called by name within an expression and gets replaced by the value that it works out. So they're both self-contained blocks of code that you can call by name. Procedures never return a value. Functions always return a single value. So in CI pseudocode, we can define procedures in the following way. We use the word procedure, followed by the name of the procedure, followed by brackets, and inside the brackets we put whatever parameters we might need. So that can be used to store values to pass in and use within the procedure. Then we write our code, and then we finish the block with end procedure. And to call it, we use the word call, the name of the procedure, and any values we want to pass into those parameters. So for example, in this case, we say call display menu. There aren't any things we need to pass into it, so we just have empty brackets. So use procedures when you want to do the same kind of block of code over and over in your program from different places within the code. For example, if you're printing a menu, that menu might have to print it in various different stages of your program. Then you can take that out and put it in a procedure. And breaking your program down into these kind of procedures helps make your program easier to understand. The main program gets smaller and simpler. You're hiding detail away in these subroutines. So it just makes your program easier to read, to test, and to maintain. So when we're doing a procedure, we have the procedure header and interface. So the first line of this is called the header. It contains the word procedure, the name of the procedure, and a parameter list. So print receipt in this case is an identifier. It's the name of the procedure, and it's what we use when we call the procedure. The parameter list is a list. It can have nothing in it, one or many items in it, but it's the parameter list, and it identifies all the variables that are used inside the procedure that get values from outside the procedure. So we'd be passing in the item and passing in the price in this case, and they would be put into these parameters for use within the procedure. And each one of those is given a parameter type, i.e. the data type of the parameter. So item is a string, price is a real. So from this header, we know exactly what we need to use the procedure. We need to know the name, we need to know the parameters, we need to know the order of the parameters, and the data type of the parameters. So as we said, you can have no parameters coming into a procedure, one or many coming in. If you've got none coming in, we use empty brackets. And it's always a good idea to remember to put the brackets in, even if there's no parameters being passed in. It is part of the syntax of subroutines to have the brackets. So if we're passing one in, then obviously we need to give the name of it and the data type. If I've got multiple ones, we just separate them with commas. So the name of it, the data type, and commas in between each one. Now there are two ways that we could pass these arguments into the parameters. We can pass by val or by ref. Now by val, you pass a copy of your argument into the parameter, and then it's used within the procedure. If you say by ref, then what happens is we get a link to the original variable passed into the procedure. So if you take the first one, by val is actually default one. So if you don't mention it at all, then it will default to this by val. And the reason it defaults to by val is because it's safer. We're not going to be affecting anything outside of the procedure when we do this. So procedure double by val n, that means that we get a copy of whatever argument that we pass in to the procedure. So in this case, we're calling it with the value num, the variable called num. Num contains 5. So we get a copy of that. We get another 5, a copy of 5, passed into the procedure. We do something with it inside the procedure, like n becomes n times 2 in this case. And inside the procedure, it outputs n. So if we pass in num, that's passing in a copy of 5. 5 comes into the n parameter. That's doubled and output, so that's output 10. Now the question is, what's happened to num after we've called that? In this case, because we use by val, absolutely nothing. Compare that with by ref on the right hand side there. So when we call by ref, and we have to say by ref if we want this method, then it gets a link to the original variable, not a copy. So in effect, there is no such thing as n and num. There is just one thing called num. So n is just like a pseudonym. It's another name for num. So when we're saying n is n times 2 inside the procedure, what we're really saying is num times 2. And output num, because that's the same thing as num. Okay, it's pointing at exactly the same thing. So after we've done that procedure, by ref, then num is actually 10. How do we choose whether to use by val or by ref? So use by val if your procedure just wants to read the data, use it, but it's not updating it to be passed back. Use by ref when the procedure needs to update the caller's variable directly, for example swapping two values, or when you're passing back more than one result. So in exams, you will need to be careful that if you're asked to trace the value of a variable in a program algorithm, then you need to make sure that you know whether you're doing by val or by ref. It makes a lot of difference to the value of variables that you're tracing depending on which version the procedure is called with. So now let's look at defining and using functions. So in CI pseudocode again, we use the word function followed by the name of the function followed by the parameter list. One difference now, you'll notice that we also have this word returns with a data type. Because a function always returns a single value, we need to know what the data type is, so our programs that call the function know how to deal with it, know what they can do with it. It can't be unpredictable as to what kind of data you get back from a function call. Then we have the actual code within the function, and there needs to be at least one return in there because we must pass back a single value. So calling it is a little bit different. We don't use the word call for functions. We just use the name of the function, its identifier, followed by any arguments we want to pass to it. And then we need to do something with the value that calculates and gives back. So in this case, we're assigning it to another variable called result. So we use functions when you want to calculate a single value that's going to be used immediately within your code in the main program. The result you get back needs to be assigned or compared or combined with something else in your code. And the subroutine shouldn't have an effect on any other program data. It just computes a single value and passes it back. A function call is part of an expression. For procedures we use the word call, but for functions we don't. You just state the name of the function and give it the arguments. It appears inside an expression, and the return value replaces the call at the point where it's written. So wherever you find the function, that gets replaced by the values, and then the whole line is calculated or executed. So for example, our assignment here, we've got area of circle 4.0 plus area of circle 6.0. So work out area of circle 4.0 first, replace that with the answer, then it will calculate the area of circle for 6.0, replace that with the answer, then add the two things together, and then assign that value to total area. And similarly for things like conditions and outputs, you just use it wherever you would use a normal value or a variable, you can substitute it for a function call. So let's compare procedures and functions side by side. So procedures never return a value, but can update values by using byref. Functions always return a single value using the word return. Procedures are called with the word call in a standalone statement. They have their line on their own. Functions are called by using the name inside an expression. Keywords for procedures are the beginning, which is procedure, and end procedure, which marks the end of the procedure block. Functions have functions, end function to mark the beginning and the end of the block. They also have the word returns in the header to tell you what kind of data type you're going to get back, and the word return inside the function to actually return the value. And procedures are typically used to perform an action. Functions are used to compute and return a single value. Remember terminology. So header is the first line of the procedural function. It gives the name and the parameters. And for function, the return data type. Interface is how we access the subroutine from our main program. So we need to know the name and the parameters, the parameter list order, and the parameter data types. And a parameter is an identifier that's in the header. It receives a value when you call the subroutine, and it's used just like a variable inside the subroutine. An argument is the value that you're going to supply to the subroutine. When you're calling it or making a function call, what values do you want to pass in? And then the return value is the single value that a function sends back to the point where it was called from, and that's done using the return statement. So we've got an example here of swap being done by a procedure. So we want to swap two values around in a procedure. Notice that this is updating two variables, a and b here, or x and y when we call it. So we need to use byref. Byref allows us to update more than one thing. And when we're calling this function, we're calling it with x and y, which have got values of 3 and 8. So 3 goes into the parameter called a, 8 goes into the parameter called b. And in fact, because we said byref, what we get is a link to the original. So effectively a is x and b is y. So when we update a and b inside our procedure, what we're really doing is updating x and y. So after our call to the procedure, the values in x and y are now swapped round. So y has become 3 and x has become 8. So on the right hand side we have an example of a function, and this function has been used to calculate something, in this case the maximum of two values. So we're calling the function with arguments x and y, and we get copies of the value of x and y going into the parameters a and b. It works out which one's bigger and returns that one. Some common mistakes. Don't Don't call a function like a procedure. So if it's a function, don't use the word call. You don't need to. That's just for procedures. Don't forget to have at least one return inside a function. All functions must have the word return in somewhere at least once. Make sure you're careful with by val and by ref. If you don't say anything at all, it's by val. If you do that or say by val, then the changes you make don't have any effect outside of the subroutine. Make sure that you get your arguments in the right order. So they're not done by name, they're done by position, so you have to get them in the right order, and make sure you get the correct data types for each one. And know the difference between parameters and arguments. A parameter is an identifier that's specified in the header and used like a variable within the subroutine, whereas the argument is the value that you're going to pass into the subroutine. Okay, that's the end of 11.3.